Hello. As Connor said, my name is Iacovides. I'm a researcher at the UCL Interaction Centre in London, and I'm going to be talking to you today about some work we've been doing around player strategies in single-player and multiplayer games. So I probably don't really need to tell you guys this, but games have become rather popular. In addition to the sort of more stereotypical type gaming experiences, casual gaming means we've got a more diverse audience of people playing than ever before. However, unfortunately, despite this popularity, up to 80% of titles will fail commercially. And also, with regards to educational games, the results of these can sometimes be mixed in terms of their effectiveness. So what I'm going to be arguing today is that one way to remedy this is to investigate what happens when gameplay breaks down. So I'm talking about this from a learning perspective that sees gameplay as a learning process, with challenge as a key component of that. And I'm going to be focusing on breakdowns and how players attempt to overcome these. And the idea is by doing so that we can think about ways in which to support learning and involvement in more effective ways. So this builds upon previous work that's been done around breakdowns and the converse of those breakthroughs, including some of my own PhD work where I looked at how these happen on 3 interrelated levels. So the first of these was action. So a breakdown in this case is something like having problems with a controller or pressing duck instead of jump, whereas a breakthrough is when you perform a new attack, for instance. In terms of understanding, a breakdown is often about not knowing where to go or not knowing what to do next, whereas a breakthrough is when you figure out a solution to a problem. So a bit like an aha moment. In terms of involvement, breakdowns tend to be around sort of negative emotions such as frustration or boredom, whereas breakthroughs are sort of more positive experiences such as experiencing satisfaction. So these are just a couple of images to illustrate those points. The game over screen, I've seen more of those than I care to remember, but that's meant to signify when multiple breakdowns occur. In terms of breakthroughs, the sort of light bulb moment there is a breakthrough in understanding where somebody's figured out a solution to a particular problem. So in terms of the literature, there hasn't been a lot of work that actually looks explicitly at player strategies. There has been some around problem solving, and apparently more frequent players make more references to insights, so breakthrough type moments, and also to game strategies, though unfortunately the authors didn't specify what these strategies actually were. Also, when playing a new game, it seems that people are more likely to use trial and error, and also refer to using friends as sources of information. I've also got the cooperative performance metrics in there because while they're actually a tool to help people look at cooperative design patterns and to evaluate games, they also suggest a couple of strategies in the form of players working out ideas together and also helping each other more directly. So basically, this research is going to address the question, what strategies do players use in an attempt to overcome breakdowns and achieve breakthroughs? And what we did was carry out 2 studies, one looking at single-player games and the other one looking at co-op play. And in both studies, we were keen to involve players with a range of expertise. And this was in order to get a sort of wider range of strategies as possible from the data sets. So study 1 was an observational study with post-play cued interview. That means we recorded the gameplay and played it back to the participants and had them talk through what they were thinking and doing at the time. We recruited 20 participants from the university participant pool. 10 of these were self-identified hardcore gamers and 10 were casual ones. We also gave them a questionnaire, which helped kind of make sure those categories were correct, and that it was around how often they played and how long they played and what different types of games they played. We looked at 2 different games, Rocket Birds Revolution and Wonderputt. So the first one is an action sort of shooter type game, or platform game really, and the other one's a crazy mini-golf puzzle game. These were both independent game finalists in different years, so they were decent quality games. They were web-based, so they were easy to pick up and play. And we asked people to play them for 20 minutes each and counterbalance the order of them. In terms of the analysis, we did a qualitative approach, which involved, similar to thematic analysis, so it's iterative, going through the data set until you can account for the number of behaviours that were observed. And we focused on incidents involving breakdowns and breakthroughs. I should say we already reported these strategies as part of a work in progress paper early on this year at CHI. But just to run through the strategies, the first one is trial and error. So this is when a player carries out an action to see what, if anything, is going to happen. A more sophisticated strategy is experiment. So this is when the player actually has some idea about what's going to happen next. So they're forming an initial hypothesis, taking an action, and based on the feedback they get, either proceeding within the game or refining their initial hypothesis. We also saw evidence of repetition. So this is when the player actually aims to gain proficiency with a certain action, so they repeat and practice what they're doing. We also saw stop and think. So this is more about not so much reflecting in action, but actually pausing the game and not acting for a while while the player considers how best to proceed. And then we've got take the hint. So this is when games provide a bit of information to the player about what to do or perhaps where to go. So this not only involves the player seeing the hint, but understanding it and deciding to follow through with it. So I've got a video here to illustrate. Hopefully that will work. So this is from Rocket Birds. Okay, so you can see a bit of repetition there. Also, a lot of trial and error. So the player's trying out the different controls. He's looking at the jump button. At one point, he draws out the gun. And also, this is an example of perhaps not taking the hint. So you can see very briefly some information flashed on the screen about how to jump. The player quickly passed through this, and during the post-play interview stated that I don't actually look at tips when I'm playing. I just like to play. This next clip is from Wonderputt. Okay, so in this case, this is an example of experiment. You can see from the quote above, the player is looking at the force of the shot, so he's saying that he needs to use a less forceful one, and every time he was doing an action, he was getting a measure of the force required. So he's taking the information he learnt from the game and thinking about how that's going to feed into what he's doing next. Right, so that was the single-player study. For the co-op play study, we looked at observing pairs of players, and we had a quick post-play interview this time, but we didn't play back a recording because there was a lot of rich dialogue going on between the players. This time we recruited 22 players, so that was 11 pairs, and there was 5 experts. So these were people that had played the game, which was Portal 2, or a previous game in the series, Portal. Novices were people who hadn't played either game, and then mixed pairs had one player who had and one player who hadn't. So the game was Portal 2. For those of you that don't know, it's a puzzle game played from a first-person perspective, and you've got a portal gun which you can use to open portals in the environment and move through. And the idea is that you can solve various puzzles through going through these test chambers within the game. Essentially, it's also got a co-op mode, which is why we used it for the study. This time in the analysis, we already had an existing set of strategies, so we wanted to apply that to the data set, and we also developed a further set of strategies to account for some of the cooperative behaviours we were seeing as well. So, in addition to the strategies we already observed, the strategies we talked about earlier, we also created some new strategies, and the first of these was knowledge exchange. So this was around how players would share and sometimes argue about the information they were gaining through the other strategies. So they would use trial and error and experiment, stop and think, things like that, and they would be discussing this as they were moving through the game. We also had guidance. So this is when a player would directly ask for help, or when another player provided guidance in the form of dictating instructions. And another interesting one that we found was this surrendering control, or taking over. While this was the less common strategy we observed, it did happen a few times. And what happened was that players would actually physically take over the other player's controller. Sometimes this was voluntary, so somebody would say, how do I do this? And the other player would show them how. And other times it happened without permission when one player was getting frustrated with the other one. So I've got a clip here of Portal 2. There's quite a lot going on here, so I'm just going to give you a bit of information about what's happening, and just to keep an eye out for. So on the bottom screen there, you're going to notice that the player with the yellow gun occasionally doesn't do anything. So he's actually looking at the other player's screen, and there's also a point where he uses something called a ping tool to draw attention to a particular object in the environment. And as you can hear from the session, there's a lot of dialogue going on between them.
So from the outside.
Okay, it goes through here.
Oh,
so
okay.
I need to
that. There, but you can't.
Yeah.
So that's a slight problem.
That'll be why that's there.
Yeah, but then can we do something like that? Like,
Self on.
yeah. So can we isn't there a button we can press to fix that? Like obviously that thing will.
Right. Oh. We've got that one cube and it has a reflection thing, so we need to put if I held the cube where I'm standing, look at my screen, then I could angle it so it points in here. So that's why. So? Yeah, we need a body.
Okay, get the cube.
Okay, so as you can see there was evidence of stop and think, where one of the players is actually not acting within the game and he's looking over at the other person, reflecting about what they should do. There was always a lot of knowledge exchange going on in terms of them discussing the environment and what they should do, and guidance in the form of things like, go get that cube so we can proceed with the puzzle. Right, so that's kind of an overview, quite quick overview of the experiments, the studies that we carried out. What I would argue is that the findings show that there is a common set of player strategies that players use across different kinds of games. And as you can see from the examples that I showed you, players tend to use multiple strategies rather than just one strategy, and also they can move quite quickly through them and jump around a little bit. I also want to draw your attention to the distinction between trial and error and experiment. So unlike G suggests in his work on how players learn whilst playing games, players are not always forming a hypothesis when they're exploring the game world. Sometimes they're more haphazard in their approach, they're just trying out different actions to see what, if anything, is going to happen, and other times they're much more systematic. This actually relates a little bit back to what we heard earlier today about moments where players are in problem-solving mode, but occasionally they're in kind of what the fuck mode, I think was the phrase. And this is when they don't actually understand what they'd have to do, but they are trying to kind of just press anything and see what happens next, essentially. So this is important from a design perspective, because while early on in the game you might want to encourage trial and error as the player kind of gains information about the world and figures out what they're able to do, later on in the game you want them to actually understand what they're doing so that they can progress through learning rather than just kind of haphazard, accidental sort of approach. This is particularly important in educational games where it's ideal to have a clearer match between the game mechanics and the learning that you want to achieve as well. I've also got a question in there around whether surrendering control is a bad thing. The answer to this is, well, not necessarily. So if it happens without permission, I would argue, yes, that's very bad, it shouldn't occur, but it could be a learning opportunity for players as well. So one of the suggestions we have in the paper is that perhaps in some co-op games there could be a sort of quantum leap mode. So Quantum Leap was, I think it was an 80s TV show where every episode the main character would jump into another person's body and live their life for a while. So the idea with this sort of mode is what you allow is for one player to briefly take over the other player's avatar, show them what to do, but then hand control back so that the original player has to do the action themselves. So this way you get learning through observation, you don't take away the player's agency because they still have a chance to carry out the action themselves, and then they can learn by doing as well. I should also note that breakthroughs do occur without breakdowns, so you don't necessarily need something to happen, something bad to happen for a breakthrough to occur. So for instance, this is testing the limits of the game through strategies such as trial and error, and an example of this was in Portal 2, where the players started messing around with the refraction cubes and the lasers and started to shoot each other rather than actually solve the puzzles within the game. So arguably this was a source of fun for them and contributed to their involvement, but didn't necessarily relate to any particular breakdowns. So what I've been arguing today essentially is that by understanding these types of player strategies and the behaviours that players engage in during gameplay, we can start to consider effective ways to support both learning and involvement. There are some limitations to the study, however. While we included 3 different types of games across 2 studies, obviously we didn't account for all the genres out there. So for instance, I'm not sure whether the strategies could account for something like resource management in role-playing games. Also, we focused on cooperative play in a co-located context rather than on an online environment, and we didn't look at competitive play either. So it'd be interesting to see whether the strategies might be seen in those sorts of play environments as well. In terms of further research, I would argue that there is scope to look more at how the strategies actually relate to each other. So I've suggested there that trial and error kind of happens earlier on in the game and gives way to experiment as the player gains a more sophisticated understanding about the world. However, this wasn't a focus of our research. We were just looking at all the strategies that were available rather than looking at how they moved on from each other. Also, in relation to the co-op study, it might be that the social dynamics within particular contexts might contribute to what strategies are adopted by players. So, for instance, you might play rather differently if you're playing with an older sibling than if you are with your partner. And I think that's it for me, so thank you very much.